because I'm a goof. I didn't switch to the intro screen, so we're live.
Hooray!
Uh, Great. So, uh, hello everyone. It is Thursday, so we're on an overflow session, and I've been going fast, so my brain hasn't caught up yet. We have an awful lot of red, and I am in a strange place today. So instead of my wonderful 4x3 monitor that we generally get to host in the stream here, I have this weird 1080p monitor that I can't convince to go 4x3. So we're a little wider than normal. But in other news, I finally have something that can do syntax highlighting. So no more notepad for me. You're welcome. All right. With that out of the way, uh, and a camera that can see me, presumably. Can I see me? I can see me. Uh, I call this meeting to order. There we go. I use the
Nice
gavel, and you
gavel.
can see it. All right. I think we had a agenda in addition to the thing. Oh, and we have a guest today for the first issue, so that makes sense. That monitor's to the right. Okay.
Hey Jeremy, how's it going?
It's going. I'm in a breakout room on campus today, and that's throwing everything off.
Oh, that's why everything looks different.
Yes, you can see the industrial concrete behind me. All right. Um, Add ability to detect if a service is registered in the DI container, issue 539er19er.
So I can give the motivation for this, kind of the quick summary, if you want. Um, in ASP.NET, we're looking at better inferences for action parameters, basically, that go into like controller actions, more or less. And right now, we use an attribute. Sorry, did someone say something? Okay. So right now you would use an attribute like from services to indicate that you want this parameter to come out of the DI container. And recently for .NET 6, we've been looking at better ways to kind of infer this. So right now, for some of our new APIs, right now we're just assuming that like any interface is probably a service, and we don't like that. So this is giving us a way to more accurately determine whether we think it's a good idea to try to resolve a parameter from service. You can always use attributes if you want to be very explicit, but this is kind of a best effort kind of thing. And we want containers to basically tell us whether a type that we might try to resolve from the container, in fact, can be resolved. But we don't want there to be any side effects. We don't want to actually like call the constructor because that could cause problems. So we're really asking if there's a registration, but then there's the whole debate in the comments about the naming. So is service is what like is our best proposal, I think, right now, as far as the name goes. So another question that came up in the discussion is how you use this interface. There have been two patterns that we've already used for DI. One is to have the iService provider also implement another interface. That was proposed in the comments, I think by Eric. There's another pattern that's used by like iService Scope Factory, which is you resolve the interface out of the container. This is more flexible. It can help with layering for some third-party libraries. Like I said, there's precedent both ways. I could see someone like mocking up this kind of service and it being somewhat useful. And that's another reason I like it being in the container.
So why wouldn't you just ask for the service and see whether it resolves?
Because that could end up doing I/O and things of that nature as it tries to construct the service, and we'd rather not, especially during just like kind of build time, like our initialization time, like startup, when we're basically determining what each like action parameter means.
So just to make sure I understand, this is really saying if I were to do that, whether I would get back something or not.
Exactly, like
Okay.
to the best the container can determine. Yeah, like it might throw, right? So really, to be very explicit, we're asking, would you return null? If so, then it's not a service. Otherwise, like if you would try to get us a service, then it's a service. Like, you know, if we ask for set type.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have existing patterns in the framework where returning true from these capability APIs, they don't necessarily mean it will work. They just mean this is a sensible question to ask, and I can attempt to give you an answer if you ask me for real.
I think that's cool, and I'm all over this. I like the naming is service, that kind of thing. The challenge I ran into with some of the naming was it's really difficult when I see an API and I say, can I do this? And it says yes. And then I try to do this and it says no. And it's like, wait a minute, you just told me I can. And I feel like it's the difference between your mom saying, you know, you say, hey, mom, can I do this? And she says, I don't know. Can you? Fine. May I do this? It's a tiny and semantic difference, but it seems like it's an important difference to make that distinction.
But if this API returns true and your actual get service API returns null, wouldn't that ostensibly be a bug in the DI system?
Well, and that's the big question here is service implies that it's registered in the container. You can query for it, but it may not necessarily resolve correctly for reasons like a dependency of that thing that you're asking for is not registered. It doesn't actually walk the tree and verify that everything is perfect and set to go. It's just, is it even present and able to be queried for?
Yeah, and that's totally fine. That's what our other capability APIs do. Like if you imagine stream, for instance, like can read true, well, all that means is that it is sensible to try calling the read operation on it. That doesn't mean it will succeed.
Okay.
So to give a little bit of background as far as the naming thing, the original proposal was can get service, which more implied what like Travis was talking about, like that it would just work. And then there's a suggestion that we change it to is registered, which I didn't like because you might be able to get a service that isn't like explicitly registered, like with IEnumerable and stuff like that. So I think is service is the best name that we've come up with so far. It seems to have a lot of agreement. Yeah.
I mean, maybe you mentioned that in the beginning and I just didn't quite understand it, but like what decisions do you base off of that? Like if that returns true, what do you do with that information?
Right. So during startup, when we're basically figuring out what controller actions in MVC are, right? So like what the parameter sources are. So like, is it coming from like the request body, a parameter, right? Like versus is it coming from a DI container? We would use this potentially for inference. Now, if you don't like what the inference is, you can explicitly use an attribute to tell you what the source of the parameter is. But this is trying to reduce kind of that attribute noise.
So if
Yes.
I call this and it returns false, what would I do there? Is this sort of like a dynamic configuration of components maybe to detect if a service is available, or?
Right, we'd fall back to another source. So in that case, like you might look at like if there's a request body makes sense or something. Is the current thinking.
Yeah, I guess my question
Or
is,
we might
so
just
would
give you a
you
good error at startup.
so basically would you have code along the lines of like if not is service, then add a service basically? So or is the assumption that if you call is service, the DI system is effectively already frozen or will be frozen by calling the method, or is the expectation you can call it, it gives you an answer, then you can register more types and then you get back a different answer?
So our container doesn't offer that functionality of adding more types. If other containers want to, I would just say, give us your current view of the world. Because like, what else can you do?
AutoFac also doesn't let you register additional stuff on the fly, so it would be more about what's already there, not query if it's there, add more, now query again. That wouldn't work for us.
Autofac in
So it really comes down.
that
So it really comes down. You fail fast with an actionable error message and say, sorry, you configured me incorrectly, or you just do something different, but you would not register stuff based on the answer of that.
Right, yeah, not with our APIs, because yeah, at this point it's built and it's too late to modify.
Okay, there are a couple.
In terms of naming, like, do you already have this pattern? I support XXX and dependency injection, or is that the first one where we have that?
There are existing interfaces that are I support. I support required service.
Yep. Now that's the one that uses the other pattern of having the iService provider also implement the interface, which, like I said earlier, is I'm not a fan of.
Yeah, because I was going to nitpick that. Yeah, but it's an existing pattern.
Yeah, but like, so the thing that follows this pattern, right, where you pull an interface out of the container that's implemented by the container itself, would be the iService scope factory. So there's precedence both way. And like, I think resolving the interface out of the container is flexible. And like I said before, I think that you can come up with like a fake version of this, which might make sense for your app, right? Because you know which services you're going to want to infer like are from a service. I would argue you're probably just better off using the attributes at that point, but I don't see why we should get in people's way if they want to try something like that.
We have a couple
right. I mean,
comments
to me,
in
I
chat.
support kind of
One question about inference is what happens with IEnumerable if string and similar, for which autofac will always return true on his service, and does the caller need a special case to avoid clash with routing?
Okay, so these are things, as far as the IEnumerable string, right now, with some of our new action APIs, we infer that's a service already because it's an interface. In the future, might we not assume that? Potentially. We'll have to think about like how we mark like behavioral options and stuff in future versions. But yeah, like we would assume it's from a service at this point for .NET 6. And you could use attributes if you don't like that.
Instead of I support service query, would it make sense to have this be like an abstract base class of service metadata to describe the container?
So what? So you're saying instead of an interface, it's an abstract base class? Like, is that the only difference?
No, I'm saying like instead of saying that this interface exists purely to support this is service method, maybe we make it broader and say this is like a metadata class so that we can add further things to pull information about the container you're using.
I like segregated interfaces for this kind of stuff. Like, you could reasonably answer just this question.
Okay.
If you did expand it, I wouldn't want it to be like, okay, now I not only want to query this, but I also want to be able to list everything. At least from an autofac perspective, that's kind of expensive, and it doesn't account for a lot of the dynamic stuff that happens underneath the covers. So I can answer this question very easily. I couldn't answer necessarily all the questions you might want to put into a metadata about container sort of thing.
Yeah, I also think that normally when we say we prefer abstract base classes, is really because people pass one instance of something around, right? And then adding new things to it isn't simple, right? If you pass an IFU around and then we want to have an IFU too, now people always have to try cast the IFU, right? But with this whole pattern of services, well, you basically, if you pass around anything, you pass around a service provider or you import the thing. So like, it really doesn't make a difference whether you have an I support service query 1 and I support service query 2, because you just ask for the one that you care about, and now they become all independent features, right? So it's, yeah, it's kind of clear where this is going.
Yeah, it's called COM.
Yeah, I mean,
Pretty much, yeah.
if having one interface per method is, more DI appropriate, then I think it's fine to keep it that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't say.
Yeah,
it's
my only
always
question
strictly
kind
one
of
interface per method.
yeah,
Sorry,
like with
but
the naming, kind of my question was when you have an I support, to me it kind of implies a try-cast. So I would have expected that you would cast the service provider to an I support service query. Like it seems a bit odd to have something that is a service to basically say I support service query rather than something that ends in service basically. that was more where I was going with the naming question.
I mean, you could call it like an iService querier or something. Like it's similar to iService Scope Factory, if you're worried about like the verbiage.
Yeah, the naming implies like something that is implemented rather than that is a thing. I mean, I don't know
Yeah, I
what
see
else to
that.
say it, but
I just wanted to confirm this iSupport service query is optional, right? It's not. And who registers it? Who implements this? Is it? Do we have it built
It's
in?
like so it will be optional because it wasn't in version 1.0, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it will be like iService Scope Factory. It will be implemented by the container. The container will make sure it's in there. And if it's not, then the consuming code will have to deal.
Have we settled on the semantics of when true gets returned and when false gets returned?
I think so, but I'll repeat it. So it should return false if get service would return null for the same type. It should return true otherwise. So that means it could throw, and it would still, like this is service thing would still return true. But the idea being you just can't possibly know whether or not actually instantiating the service would throw until you do it.
But it could never return true, and then when you call get service, it returns null.
Right. That would be certainly the contract that our RDI would follow, and I would argue that is the contract. And so for anything that's in the iService collection, we'll have conformance tests that verify that as well for the containers that do support this.
All right. Is there any thing left to talk about?
Just naming, I think, is settling on the name.
Just one question. Just one question so I can understand the semantics. So what are the decisions that one makes? So this returns true. What are the decision one makes on that without actually then querying for the interface? Because as you say, it could fail to query. What can you do without actually trying to get it?
So at startup, right, when we're building like our open API, like Swagger stuff, we'll say that, hey, this parameter we expect to come from a service, and because there are no attributes, right, but the container told us that it can give us that, and it won't change, right? So then we don't dynamically change like where a parameter comes from at runtime based on like what get service is doing. Like this is a static thing for the lifetime of the application, at least, that we can determine.
But presumably in that case, you would do something differently if this returned null versus if you had tried to get it and it threw.
Well, if we try, like we will try to get it if it returns true, right? The difference is now you'll
try to get
have like an
you'll
error
try to get it
during
immediately.
the request. No, you wouldn't.
Sorry, you'll try to get it immediately, or you try to get it delayed.
So at startup in ASP.NET, we'll query this. The first request that's to a given endpoint will resolve. So different times.
Okay, but if today in ASP.NET, if you call get and it returns null versus you calling get and it throws, do you do something differently in those two situations today, or you do the exact same thing?
So it's a different error today. Like if something has like the from server, so we're changing the behavior as far as inference to use this, right? But today, we assume that any interface is a service in this API we're talking about. So if get service returns null, there's an exception that's thrown and logged that will be like the service wasn't found. So this it just improves the inference, right? Because like right now we're assuming any interface is a service, and that's like kind of a silly assumption.
I think the really good use case is the first one listed in the issue. For activator utilities, trying to pick which constructor. It's above this actually. For activator utilities, trying to pick which constructor. Because like, say you have a class and it has 10 constructors on it, all with different overloads. Trying to find out, does this parameter have a service, right? If you have one A, B, and C parameters, or is there services for each one of those? And today it can't do that without, it just can't do that today.
But that's not necessarily going to go deep, right? Like, it would get you one level closer, because if each of A, B, and C itself depended on 10 things, I don't think the expectation is this is going to ask, could I then also figure out how to construct those? So that's the difference between get throwing or when it returns true. Someone called the register singleton, but no one actually proved that it could be instantiated.
But just the fact that someone tried to register or provide services for every constructor parameter is, again, a lot better than the current logic, in my opinion.
It lets you skip over the ones that you know just aren't going to work, right?
Right.
Like that's the scenario. It's like there's two of them, one with 3 args and one with 4 args. It's like, well, which one should I pick? The one with 4 args doesn't have a registered service, so I shouldn't pick that one.
Right. I guess it's more, it can tell you which things can't work versus which things will work.
Exactly.
Right, that's
and
the
like
way to
even
think
knowing
about
things that could never work without having any side effects is useful.
I can see
Like,
this being useful if you have 2 possible services that you might use, and you want to pick the newer or the better of them, and you don't want to accidentally instantiate some service that you would have never used in the first place by just querying if it gets supported.
With the 2 of them in the new one, wouldn't you just query for the new one first? And if it's not there, then fall back for the old one?
Yeah, maybe the new one has additional services attached to it that you'd want to pull into. So it seems like you could end up over instantiating things that you may not need, and this could help solve that. It seems like a bit of maybe a rare case, but it seems like the usage of this is kind of for a rare case.
Well, we made it five releases without it, so. Steve, are all your questions answered? Cool.
I mean, I honestly don't fully understand it, but smart people on the call do. So I'm struggling to understand. There are 3 possible answers, right? There's, this is not supported. This is definitely supported, and we're not sure. And this API can tell you 2 of the 3. But you could absolutely, like, so let's, that situation we discussed where there were 2 possible things you might want to use, right? If this says one of them is supported and you go down that route, but then you try and construct it and it fails, well, you've sort of gone down, you've gone to maybe a place of no return. Whereas if you were just constructing it from the get-go, you do know yes or no, did this work or not? So I'm still struggling to understand where the answers that this API provides actually prove useful in the cases where they're intended. But I'm probably just not understanding the use case.
So related to this, may I ask, so basically the true false thing here, if it's registered, then it would return true, regardless of, even if it will be able to be resolved. Is that correct? Or is this so if I have a bunch of, like if I have A, B, and C registered in the container, but not necessarily all of their dependencies are. So if I were to resolve it today, it would throw and say this is not properly registered. In this case,
Right. Yeah.
this will be returning false. Actually, this
It'll
will,
be
in this
returning
case, will
true.
be returning true. So
Yeah.
would it be better to rename is service to is registered?
Yeah. So I mean that is the old conversation. So the problem is with that is there are things that aren't explicitly registered that you could resolve. So we were talking about like is resolvable and stuff, but yeah, we landed on is service. The point you make is interesting, and that was even worse when like this API was called like can get service, because there you really would think that like it shouldn't throw if it returns true. Is registered is interesting, but again, I think it muddies the water because you can resolve some things that you might not have registered or might not have feel you registered, like the container just provides it or whatever.
You mean like IEnumerable or like generics?
Right. Yep. Stuff like that.
Would it help if we flipped it? Because this API can only tell us what's definitely not possible, would it be help if we named it as such? Right? That's the only question this thing can really answer definitively, is what won't work.
I mean, it's Boolean logic, right? Like, even if you call it is not service, it's still like the same problem.
Can you give me Stephen, can you like just put my mind at ease? Give me a concrete example where where this helps in some meaningful way over what's currently there. So right now, you would query to do the check, you would actually instantiate the thing. Here, you would access the Boolean and it returns true. Is the savings that you're just avoiding? You're delaying the I/O? Is it that you're worried about the cost of the exception if it would otherwise return? Sorry, go ahead.
It's not the exception, right? It's like we're no longer like lazily initializing services, which is kind of what people expect, right? So there can be, I mean, there's logic in a lot of ASP apps to at startup resolve services because you want to greedily initialize it, but we don't want to like force the greedy initialization just because you happen to reference a service in a parameter list because we're trying to figure out like the sources of the parameters.
So this is not intended and should not be used in a situation where you're trying to decide which way to go, A or B. This should only be used in a situation where you only want to know, can I use A or not? It's a light up feature, and you just want to avoid having to do that initial query earlier on, but there's always a possible fallback later. Is that a correct summary?
I'm not sure. So let me try to rephrase what I understood back to you.
Okay.
So I honestly wonder if Eric isn't right and the activator utilities example isn't better than like the MVC action scenario. But since I've been talking about that a lot, right now, like with what we're doing, we're assuming any interface is a service. So like the idea that it could fail at like request time is like already a thing. Like if it's not in there or if it throws, like when we try to resolve it, like that's already gonna surface the same way. We're just trying to be a little bit smarter with our inference about like whether or not this thing is actually a service. Now, if we get it wrong, like, it should be wrong every time, right? So like in that case, like just use the attribute and say that, you know what, the containers, like, I don't even know. But like, I don't think it's that big of a deal. The activator utilities, I think, is a better example in that it just tries the longest constructor right now. Like, even if it's like absolutely impossible for the thing to be resolved. And we should think of, I think, service providers as pretty static. I mean, at least, Microsoft Extensions DI is, and so is AutoFac. So, like, these answers shouldn't change.
So you're saying the default provider will return true for if someone asks, what's the thing that should never really exist? I had one. I custom formatter, right? get service is service I custom formatter, it's going to say true because it's an interface, and it's not going to look and see that no one has actually bound a type against that interface for DI.
So that's the terrible behavior that's in the preview right now, right? And then once we get this, we'll only assume it's an interface if the container tells us it is.
Right.
Because
the interface assumption is coming from ASP.NET, not from DI.
Right.
Because
I'm just saying, like, you think this is bad. What we're doing now is bad.
Okay. Because really so I sort of mirror what Steve said of I don't quite get it, but of what I've heard, the only question you can answer authoritatively is this will not work, which basically means the only question you can answer is service unknown? That is the only question you can actually answer. If is service returns true, that means it's the same as if you didn't call it. If it returns false, you know something. And I think that indicating that it returns a negative answer and that true is the only authoritative answer, it would be better, but that's probably marginal. And if you think that the true but doesn't work case is relatively rare, then whatever. But that's the only concern I've had from what I've heard is true is meaningless, false is authoritative. And that's weird.
Like, so here's the thing. If it returns true, I'd argue the service exists. Like, if it doesn't have all the dependencies it needs, like, that's an error we want to surface. We can't surface it at startup because that breaks lazy initialization. We have to wait to surface it until the first request because, like, that's what people expect. And yes, like, if it's a service, like, if it's a thing, like, even if it doesn't have all of its dependencies, even if it would throw, like, we want to try to resolve it and then surface that error to the user. But, like, not before we're supposed to.
Fair enough. I mean, all I know is when we talked about the activator instance thing, the conclusion was it can eliminate things, but it can't tell you what things will work because of the dependency thing, which to me means true is a useless answer, especially if the interface thing holds, or open generics holds, or like any of the like, well, we can't answer this until we actually try doing it means true is a useless answer.
But you can answer whether or not like the container will try to give you that service, right? And that's important because if you try to get a service that the container thinks you can get and then it throws, like that's misconfiguration usually, like always. I don't know. So like, yeah, I don't see it being a problem. Like, yes, if it says it's a service and it throws, it should throw. You want to see that exception. You just don't want to like do it greedily.
So basically, it's a two-layer check. Like first you have a lightweight check for each service, and then you deciding, okay, you're proceeding to get service. And basically, I think you believe that if you checking for a service first and it returns true, then it's very big likability or probability that get service will return something meaningful. And if it doesn't return, it's usually some misconfiguration or user error.
Even the exception is meaningful, right?
Should be sufficient.
Yeah. But like in that case, is it true? Is it true that if it returns true, but then trying to get it throws, that's a bug?
Right.
Yeah, it's a bug, probably on the customer's or consumer side.
Okay, so if that's the case, if returning true means, it should never throw, and it does, that's a bug, just like an argument exception or something that you're using this API wrong, then my concerns go away. If it's that you return true.
You forgot to register something additional, like to make the promise, to fulfill the promise for the service.
Okay. Yeah, if it's like we often refer to these as usage errors. Sorry, we often refer to these as usage errors versus none. So like if this is a usage error, you return true, but then it fails to work, and you discover this at development time because you're being silly in your development. Fine. That's like passing the incorrect value to a function and then having to fix your code. If it's you deploy this to production, it returns true, but something transient in your environment, network goes down, CPU is too high, whatever causes this thing to throw, that's a concern. You know what I mean?
It's very rare occasion, I suppose. And yeah, it probably safe to use that something just random happened.
So there is, of course, like, okay, so there is the possibility that like the constructor of your service is like trying to do IO that fails, right? Like, yes, that's a thing, but again, like, I don't see why we're freaked out about that. Like, we'll figure that out when we try to get the service. Like, the whole point is we're trying to avoid all these side effects.
My concern is if there's a cascade of, I want to do A, and if I can't do A, I want to do B instead.
It's basically
I do. Let me just finish my thought. And so if I change today, I try and get A, and if it either returns null or throws, I do B. Tomorrow with this API, and I rewrite my logic at startup to change my behavior such that I query, is A available, else use B. And then in my actual implementation, I just, whichever thing I know I'm supposed to use, I just always use A or I always use B. I've now changed my fallback behavior in those transient error cases. That's my primary concern. If that doesn't happen, if that's not a thing, then this seems fine. If that is a thing, this worries me.
I mean, I think Levi's earlier example was actually useful, right? If you think about file stream, you know, we say can write is true, but then when you write 4 gigabytes and you only have 1 gigabyte left, it will still fail, right? So it just basically the partial definition only allows you to reason about one side of it that you know for sure won't happen, right? It's not that the thing will throw because the underlying stream fundamentally can't be written to. That doesn't mean that it will guarantee to work, right? But like, I mean, if in the constructor thing, you can basically discard all overloads where you know that the types that are accepted aren't services because they will definitely not work. So now you're stuck with the ones that maybe like are services, but when you activate them, they might still explode.
Right. So we expect that the valid use of this API is to exclude a bunch of things that we know that won't work definitively,
right?
Or as a optimization to avoid doing stuff until we absolutely have to, but any kind of fallback logic that we would have where if something didn't work, do something else instead, still needs to exist in the get case in addition to the is case. It's not like the is replaces it. And that's the intention, Stefan?
So the intention is, because it's most of the time in this configuration, if is service returns true, we'll call get service at some point later, right? Potentially, because we don't expect that to change. And if that does throw, we'll report that appropriately, like we do today. And if is service returns false, then we might infer that it's another source at startup.
Yeah, I guess let me rephrase Steven's question. Do you have code today in ASP.NET where you basically try to activate something, and if that returns an exception, you conclude, oh, this wasn't a service, now try something else? Because if you replace that code with this check, you have changed behavior because that's not the same semantics.
Right, but what you described, we don't do. That seems kind of fragile because exceptions can be transient, and you don't want to change like where things are taken from. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's not it. So that was my question. That's not a thing, in which case I don't have any concerns.
Right. Okay, cool. I actually agree about the I support service query being weird if you tool it out of the container. So before we, like, assuming that we're getting closer to approving this, do we want to change it to like I query services? I don't know.
Maybe something like more in phasing on the registration of the presence of the registered service in the service collection. Something like is in service collection, or I don't know, to avoid the ambiguity here.
to be clear, we don't necessarily want it to just apply to services in the service collection, right? Like if you added a service registration like directly with Autofact, we'd like it to reflect that.
Yeah. I know that some registration are implicit or provided by other sources like example in Autofact or the containers. But just justify that it is something like present or not present in a collection of services and in a registry. But we do not have anything like we do not have word registry here, so maybe invent something similar to that. Maybe just provide some variants and vote.
So you guys don't like iQuery services? Is there any, like, I'm not sure how to put, like, again, I hesitate.
It's very connotation with COM interface, and query is like, I don't personally like it.
I see.
Someone already said COM once.
Yeah.
So the current iSupport required service, where does that fit in? How does someone use that? Like, I'm just seeing if we're using iSupport the same way.
So yeah, I don't want to like pigeonhole into that because this is the name we chose, but like that way you would ASCAST, right? I do not like that pattern. I prefer using like the iService scope factory pattern.
Oh, I mean, so I know nothing about the DI system, so start with that. Is there something that you use in the same? Hold on, I got to get a cursor on the right screen. Up is right, which is weird. So is there something that you would use in the same spot that is asking a capability about your provider itself already? Is that what the service scope factory does?
Right, because the containers need to provide a way that isn't iService provider, right? Because that just gives you Git service. That's the entire interface. To create scopes, right? For like, ASP.NET requests and other things. And that controls the lifetime of your scope services and transients for that matter. So this is similar, right? Like the container is giving you kind of extra functionality on top of what iService provider gives you. So is, the required service thing too. I'm not claiming it's the only thing that's like that. But this pattern is more flexible. And if you read some of the comments, it allows the core container to not take a dependency on our dependency, our DI like abstraction class, right? And not everyone wants to in their core like container class. Sometimes that's like a package that's, additional.
So how does iSupport required service work today? It's the same way?
Right. So any third-party container that wants to support that right now just has to take a dependency or like not use their actual container as an iService provider. And they have to put their like iService provider in this like third package. So, I mean, yeah.
So to be clear, if you want to use iSupport required services, that's another interface that you implement on the service provider. It doesn't get resolved like this.
Yeah, that was kind of my question.
Right.
Like, because if the thing is implemented versus resolved, I think that might be a worthwhile differentiation, similar to iService scope factor. I mean, you could call this literally, I is service provider, right? Like as boring as it gets, because it just provides you this one method, right? But yeah, I think that might be a worthwhile distinction, just things that the provider implements versus things that get resolved through the I, right? Or as a service, I guess is the terminology.
Like, what about iService query support?
I think query was objectionable. I was wondering if you were trying to get rid of that.
I would go with something that I can parse.
Fair enough. Like, yeah. So, personally, I think the name is fine for DI. How's that?
Oh, come on.
No, like this is not a line of code that I would ever architect in my life.
Well, says the guy that works in crypto.
Right, but like the notion, like if this was from scratch, then this would really not be a get service. It would be a get capability, and now you would be describing a capabilities thing, even if you wanted it to be thing. Like it would be a different universe than like because this is weird. It's just using a hook for this is the only way we have of asking you a question. It's basically an abuse of the function and fine, but like once we're doing that, now kind of nothing matters, and it's just whatever it's called. It's called. This is the line of code people write, and I don't think anyone cares.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go quite that far. I think like DI is kind of.
But having a pattern for, interfaces whose names kind of look like blank are expected to be that the service provider is using that as a question about itself, and no one should really register them. It's supposed to be a self-descriptive thing. Then, like, fine, come up with that naming proposal. But I don't think that the majority of the people in this meeting use DI and therefore have opinions. But that's really my only that's why it's the is I support right, and you said I service scope factory is the right model, but that doesn't have a name that we can work off of unless we say it's I service something something, which is why I move support to the end. But
yeah, that's why I said provider, because I mean that's the other thing. But yeah, I mean I don't have strong opinions. If the people that owning the I think it's okay to call it I support, what is it? I support service query. That's fine by me.
I mean, we're not in love with it. I actually like the I is service provider, other than it's very close to I service provider.
Oh, that's fair, actually. Yeah.
Because that's just the IIS service provider.
Right. I mean, at least it's case sensitive, but no, it would actually just be that way with our capitalization conventions, wouldn't it? Anyway.
No, it'd be big I.
No, lowercase s.
Lowercase s. Yeah. But yeah.
For the naming, the only objection I have is if we're going with this pattern and we already have I support required service, like it doesn't feel like we should use the same naming pattern here if we're using a different usage pattern.
I agree with that. And that's why
they're the only two things that are I support something.
Right.
And for them to be used differently just feels wrong.
Yeah, that's fair. One, you're supposed to SP as I support something, and the other is asking a question of get service. So,
and we've completely thrown out query. We don't want to use query at all. Is that the decision?
I check service existence. I'm trying hard to get rid of query.
How about I unknown?
Nice. You don't want to do con, we might as well break it.
I think when WinRT started, their root interface was called iKnown. And then they said they can't do that. That would be too much on the nose. But yeah, I think the idea is like if you actually go down that pattern, it would be worthwhile to think about a pattern for this particular case that you have here, where you want to add one method that is resolved via DI, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I provider info service support
manager factory,
something like. But
yeah,
right now where it says support, basically it's come up with a way that's expressing it's supposed to be a self-descriptive answer. So provider info, self, whatever.
I check service exists. It's not that bad. Because we're trying to get support and query out of the name. It sounds like those are two words that people don't like.
Well, the only problem with support is you currently have a Microsoft Extensions dependency injection .iSupport thing, which is used in a different manner than calling get service. So you just can't start with support. The word support can be in it somewhere. The word I have no objection to the word query. I think you're the one who doesn't like it. If I followed correctly.
I picked that up from Max. One of my first suggestions was I query services. Or something like that. But
the problem with services is like you have one method. It's kind of like oh my god, this is interesting, and then you find one method that says it's service. It's a bit underwhelming.
Yeah.
But it does query services, I mean, there are more than one service.
Fair enough.
Or there is.
I mean, if you're just changing the name around because I support service query looks like it should be implemented on the provider. I mean, you could just do I service query provider or something like that and call it a day because it's a provider of the query support. I think below, some folks actually did suggest that the iService provider should just implement the thing, and jury was sort of out on that. I don't feel terribly strongly about it, but it does seem odd to have some of it implemented, like I support required services on the service provider, but then this new thing not on the service provider. That seems kind of weird to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Eric's in the chat, and I think he was one of the first to suggest that. And like, again, I'll push back in that, yes, that's a pattern, but the older pattern, the more flexible pattern, is the iService scope pattern factory. So like there are two. We definitely shouldn't introduce a third one, but I prefer resolving it out of the service provider.
I mean,
because
that's
it's more flexible.
I mean, that's another stance you can take, right? You can say the things that are I support XXX. It depends on the scenario, whether they are casted or whether they are actually just resolved via DI, right? And it might even differ based on DI systems, right? I mean, you could argue that this is plumbing and people shouldn't use it. They should call this, has service type of T or has service type extension method instead, and that thing does the right thing, right? Like you could go down that path, in which case I think it would be okay to call it I support XXX because you say, well, yeah, read the documentation. That's also fine. I mean, my concern is more along the lines of you have two different, like basically you have one naming convention that has two different usage patterns. One option is to have a different naming convention or just unify the usage pattern. And so you could just unify the usage pattern.
You can't really unify the usage pattern in this case. Like the usage patterns are what they are. It's not worth breaking for the two existing things.
Well, it would be this becomes an as instead of a get service. That would be the unification.
For this, I know what the suggestion is, right? Yeah. No, I get it. Like you as cast the iService provider. It's just less flexible. And I don't think that, like, I think we should come up with a better name than just like switch the pattern because the name we first came up with is more similar to the other pattern. Because again, I like the more flexible older pattern. And like other than the name, I haven't heard any problem with it.
I mean, one other option is why we could just call it I is service, right? Basically, just name the thing as the method, prefix it with I, and that's your naming convention.
The weird thing is that sounds a lot like a marker interface. Like, I am a service. Another thing I noticed is you were calling this has service instead of is service, which I honestly don't mind that as a method name either. I don't know. Is has service better than is service?
I think it depends on what you're calling it on. I think if you're calling it on something, right. I think has makes sense.
I think I prefer is. I would just bring it up.
Right.
Especially with you're resolving another thing out of the service provider thing.
I still have a question. I haven't figured it out yet. So as of today and like previous versions, if someone writes this has service type, it's obviously going to return null, right? And then in .NET, and then after this is in, so the expectation is that it would still return null. So in the usage examples, there's no, so I was wondering if there's any usage sample that shows what the developer needs to do to make sure the support service query is registered. So it's going to be on the developer to do that, or is it going to be built in our own DI container? So like every time we like set up DI, then we expect this not to be null.
So it's going to be exactly like Service Scope Factory in that it will be implemented by the container. Because it wasn't in 1.0, the consumers of the code cannot just expect it to be there, right? Because it hasn't been in like the conformance test since like the beginning of like Project K. However, like our container will have it, and we're involving the DI council. We're hoping the other containers add it quickly. You could add a polyfill if you really wanted to. You can also use attributes, right, for your like action parameters and stuff potentially. But like the common users of this would be like the ASP.NET framework, perhaps activator utilities. It is fair to say that I don't expect many like web applications or console applications to be calling this directly. This is more of a framework level concern.
Okay.
Out of curiosity,
it
for
grew
people
up
on
in
the Teams call, can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. It's apparently now entirely a virtual screen. The TV has decided it no longer wants to share the signal, so that's fun.
So you can't see it.
Right. I can see it through OBS. That's it.
Okay.
So, question: if there's any risk in this new pattern with get service, is there any risk that somebody is going to intentionally or possibly unintentionally shoot themselves in the foot by registering one of these things that disagrees with what's actually in the container?
So are you saying that what happens if somebody implements it and it returns false even though the container knows about it?
Or returns true knowing the container doesn't know about it? Like, I could see, at least at the Autofact level, we have a lot of folks who want to unit test the dependency injection itself, and they try to mock the container, and they try to mock like way too much stuff. And I can see folks going, oh, I'm going to unit test this thing and mock my iSupport service query, and everything unit tests out great, except in real life, in whatever edge case they run into, it doesn't, and they're wondering, then it's a support issue where I have to explain, hey, you registered an override for iSupport service query that isn't actually the one that matches what's actually in the container.
Right.
I'm wondering if that's like a foot gun waiting to happen for folks, inadvertently seeing this, not really understanding, and then stumbling into a problem.
So that's
that
an
might
interesting question.
I mean,
So
my initial
I think
reaction would
as
be
op-
that you just say you're holding it wrong. I mean, like that's generally the problem with many features is just because something can be abused doesn't necessarily mean that we don't do it. It's more for me the question of like how likely is it? Like if you think there's some hardcore people that will do that and they hang themselves, I think that's fine. If you think it's very common because it's basically you lead people down the wrong path with the naming or the shape of an API, then I think that's a valid concern. But like almost any feature we build, there will be somebody who will use it in a way that is just counterproductive. But that's why I think it's hard to like use it against the feature.
That's fine.
We're not going to put that scenario in the conformance test. So it's like Autofact, you could choose just to ignore a registration to this. I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying like you wouldn't be non-compliant if you decided that was going to be too much of a problem to support.
Sure. I'm just trying to think like, when there's like, 10, 20, 30 questions about that for a larger team to answer, that's not as big of a deal as when there's like, two guys trying to handle Autofact questions and it's the same question over and over. So I'm trying to balance the pit of success with maybe the better pattern is all. So
I mean, basically,
it's funny that you think we have 30 people working on this. No, I mean, obviously we have a lot of people reviewing and so forth.
I mean, it sounds almost like what you're asking is like, should the container just implement the interface, in which case the user can't override it?
Yeah, which honestly is like I had that thought earlier and I wasn't going to express it, but someone did. I had the same. It's weird that it's get service because someone could register it, or you're going to block the registration of it or ignore it. When this is really asking about the provider itself. So as is really the C# natural usage of this. Like that is like it's named the right thing. You're just using it wrong.
So it breaks the polyfill for containers who might be late to adopt this. It removes, So that's one thing. I honestly don't think it's that useless. We're not going to provide like a default implementation of iSupport service query, but I could see it being handy.
How could you polyfill this?
I mean, there are a couple ways. If you don't care about the side effects, you could just like try to resolve it, right? Like for your particular application, and check if it's null, and you know, catch exceptions. Like not everyone does care about the side effects, but that would be an application decision. You could also just do something based on the service collection, and you'd have to have some smarts around open generics and how enumerables are handled. And we're not going to write that, but it's theoretically possible.
Sorry, are you basically saying that the you know, the, I don't know what we call it, the stock DI that we ship doesn't implement this? It would only be implemented by third-party implementations of DI?
No. Our implementation would be internal. It'd still be in the service provider. That's all.
But it will be available by default. So if I actually build the ASP.NET app for .NET 6 and I basically ask for get service, I support service query, I will get back an instance.
You could do like a parallel registration, right? And then pull one out of our container and put it in another container. Like you do all sorts of crazy stuff. I just don't understand like why we're trying to get in people's way. Like,
no, I'm not trying to make a statement. I was just asking. Like basically, are you saying that so there will be an implementation, but like basically what I don't understand is the polyfill. Like is basically the question is, I use, let's say, Autofac from yesterday that doesn't have support for service query with .NET 6, and then I provide an implementation for Autofac by registering this interface myself. Is that what you mean by polyfill?
Right, because right now, if you use an old version of Autofac, right, and I assume like Autofac will probably have this pretty quickly. You guys are usually pretty responsive, so that's great. But let's say that like, you know, it wasn't there for whatever reason, someone's trying to use the previous, they would have to put like from service, you know, post this change on like all their service attributes, which is fine. That's actually probably the better workaround than the polyfill. But like if someone wants to do a polyfill and says like, you know what, I know which services I want to infer coming in to my actions, then I don't really see the problem. Like it could literally be a switch statement, right? Like again, like, use at your own risk. We're not going to ship it, but like these things are pretty static.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, chat from YouTube points out an interesting conundrum, which is if some service providers declare that they conform to this interface, then now you have the terribleness that some things the ascast works and then other things it doesn't, and that's hard to use. So it's sort of a, if you want it to be the get service thing, then you kind of really want to put in the docs, no one should ever be both an iService provider and an this thing. Or you should just do the ascast, is my opinion. And I think the prevailing opinion in the YouTube chat.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, you could always say like, you know, it's an implementation detail how the interface is implemented, and users should never use as, that should always go via get service. And if the service provider happens to do that by return this, that's fine. Like
I guess,
I think
but if Autofac decides that they're going to make their provider just implement the thing, and their answer to get service is return this, and you start with Autofac and you didn't call get service, you called as, then now you just have the wrong expectations that look completely reasonable, especially if it starts with iSupport.
No difference in Service Scope Factory, and like ours won't implement it. So, I mean, yeah, it's not a different problem, and it does give you that flexibility.
So here's the thing: we're not talking about this for an hour and 10 minutes. It
Yep.
seems like we should wrap this up somehow. I think, to me, like the interface makes sense. I think the name of the method makes sense. I think the one thing that we can't seem to, you know, conclude is basically the name of the interface. But I also don't think it's necessarily useful to do this with 30 people on a call. So maybe just go back, try to come up with a name that you like more than what we have right now. And then we can just wave it through. Because I think like nobody really pushes back on the scenario at this point. It's just that we don't like the name. I think that's the predominant.
Can we come up with a straw man that's like better than iSupport service query? Like I would have accepted like many of the alternatives, because I do agree. Like starting it with iSupport is whatever, and then we can take it and get it like tentatively approved. And if we change it again, we'll just take it back to API review just for the name.
I mean, one suggestion kind of in chat is kind of you suffix iService provider. I'm not sure I like the actual suggestion here with iService provider contains service and then the method is contains service, but you could have iService provider is service and that has an is service method on it, right? That's one pattern. The other pattern that I think I suggested was just method name plus an I in front of it, so I is service. I think Eric suggested iService query provider, but I think you don't like query. So I think we
I
have
like iService provider is service, and if other people dislike it, we can take it back. Like if David Fowler, right, decides that that's just a terrible name, we'll discuss just that. But like for now, I do agree that like I support service query is wrong. So let's do I service provider is service or something.
Yep, that works for me. Anybody else?
Looks good.
Yay! Looks like we resolved an API.
I'll probably comment this, just something to keep in the back of your mind. I recall that the usage was mentioned that you can query it and then like maybe cache the result or something. Be careful with over eager querying, simply because on at least in AutoFac, you can add new registrations on creation of a lifetime scope. So the answer may change based on whether you're in a request versus at application start time sorts of things. So don't go too crazy caching.
So you'd recommend doing this inside a scope for AutoFac?
Well, no. I'm saying like if you were trying to resolve middleware dependencies to pass into invoke or whatever, the ability to resolve those things may change based on somebody adding or changing registrations when the request services are created. So, yeah, we can go back. I don't want to eat up more time on the call.
We can discuss this offline. Yeah,
we can definitely put it in the there or whatever. But naming good, usage pattern good. I'll see you guys on the issue here.
Cool.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for humoring us for 75 minutes.
Yep.
Oh, thanks for the invite.
All right. Since we now have a name that does not start with I support, and I think that we all are out of carrying capacity right for this issue, I'm gonna say it's approved. I think that's what we're at. Sounds great.
Thank you.
Approved by perceived apathy. Huzzah. I mean, Stefan cares, so someone does care.
Wow. Hey, we had external people. Thank you.
All right. The second promised thing is nullability from reflection. And so I will introduce the issue, and then you guys will get to look at an empty chair for a minute while I run to the restroom. All right. Top level nullability information, exposing it from reflection, 29723. Where should I scroll to before I disappear for a minute?
The screen hasn't updated yet, so.
All right, then I will stop sharing and reshare on Teams because a cable got unplugged and replugged to fix the TV.
Okay, I can see the base for the gavel. All right. Yeah, that works.
All right.
Yeah, scroll kind of down, I think, to the actual API proposal, because I think So we talked about this before. So the basic idea is we want to be able to surface nullability annotations through reflection, and the general scenarios are anybody who basically tried to reasons about the type system to do something interesting. One example is EF, where you basically create tables out of .NET types, where you have a customer type, and you may make middle name nullable, and then you would expect when the table is created that the middle name column is basically also marked as nullable, right? And today you would have to use custom attributes for that because we don't really have a way to do that. But it seems, given that C# has the ability to annotate nulls, that you would expect EF to honor that indicated nullability in the underlying database. And same thing happens to like serialization. You could imagine if things are marked as non-nullable, that serializers might reject types that where not all properties are initialized from the payload, for example. Or you might expect have something like model binders where if things are not initialized, instead of rejecting the whole thing, you just mark the resulting model as is invalid, and then maybe there's detailed errors in the model binder that you can ask and say, yep, first dim was supposed to be non-null or something. And so the question is, how would you do that? Because if you want to read custom, like if you want to read the nullability annotations today, that's fairly involved because they're not just simple custom attributes. They are kind of, specially encoded to keep the metadata somewhat compact. The compiler has written a very lengthy spec, so it is, something you can definitely do. It's just not trivial to do that. And so what this basically represents is a reflection-based approach where we just effectively expose an API where you can ask that. The reason we have this on a different type called nullability info context is because we want to do some caching, and we want to be able to say the user creates the duration or the lifetime of that cache. So the idea is you start with creating a nullability info context, and then you query basically that context, and that context does whatever caching it wants to do. And then you basically let the nullability info context go out of scope. The GC just, disposes the cache. The actual nullability info that you get back looks very similar to an instance of type. So it mirrors basically the properties type, element type, and generic type arguments from type. So if you think about how a signature works, let's say you have a method, for example, that returns an IEnumable of string. The instance of system type will have generic type arguments because it's an instance of IEnumable. And so when you ask for the generic type arguments there, you get back, the string instance. And the same recursion is basically expressed here, except that you don't use types. You basically recurse over itself, right? So the element type is now another nullability info that tells you what that is. To make it a bit more convenient, we basically don't expect users to walk the type and nullability info at the same time, which is why we expose the underlying system type directly on the nullability info itself. So you can see that, you have an IEnumable, that will be the type. And then the read state might be, null or not null, depending on what the annotations are. And so the actual enum just reflects the 3 states that C# has. Like things that are not annotated are considered unknown. And then if you don't put a question mark, then it's not null. If you put a question mark, then it's maybe null. So we can talk about the naming here because the unfortunate thing is that the way the compiler APIs expose it is not very friendly. I think they have annotated, not annotated, and I forgot some other states. So it's like the naming convention that they have in the compiler APIs doesn't really flow or gel with how we publicly talk about nullability information. So that's why we ended up with the ones that we have on screen here. But Booyah suggested instead of using maybe null, we should just use not null. Null, or it can be, or like is null or whatever. But I think the idea of nullable. Yeah, that was the suggestion, right? Yeah. Which I think is also fine. I think for the user unknown, not null, nullable makes sense. I don't have strong opinions on that one. The other suggestion that Booyah had was, so if you ask right now, you can see in the nullability info context, there's no create that takes a method, because the way reflection does it is that if you want to get the return type, a method has a return parameter, basically that describes the return itself. And so you would basically pass that in if you want to know the return type of a method. That might not be super discoverable. So she suggested maybe we should have a create method that just takes a method info and it gives you back, not a method info, probably a method base. So you can do it, I guess for constructors, it doesn't really make sense, but you would basically be able to get it from there. The only concern that I have with doing that is that we split the nullability information in read state and write state. So that was the suggestion from last time, because we have custom attributes that you can put on parameters, for example, where you can, one direction is nullable but the other one is not, for example, or properties where the setter is nullable but the getter isn't. And so that's why we basically split it into read state and write state. So you could imagine if you ask for a method that people might expect that the read state is the return value and the write state is the one argument you can pass to the method. But I think it would be fine to also have a method dedicated for method info. And I think the only other question that came up last time, if you scroll down, Jeremy, like there was the question of like which custom attributes are we actually looking at? And so I went over all of them. So if you scroll down further, yeah, here we go. So basically we have a bunch of them. So some of them are related to flow analysis. So does not return if, maybe null when, member not null when, not null if, not null when. They don't really make sense to ask statically for an API. They only really make sense to ask like in the context of a particular flow graph, right? Just like, can this be null right now based on what code you have before and after, right? So that doesn't really make sense for reflection. The other ones we have, allow null, disallow null, maybe null, not null. They're all static. They just basically represent different ways, where the one direction can differ from the other direction. So those we will actually process, and we will combine it with the actual question mark annotations on the type itself. And so you can totally have, properties where, the setter is nullable, but the getter isn't, for example. And then, we would reflect that by the read state and write state properties. Jeremy, you're muted.
Thanks. Maybe null is the attribute that you put on a T, which is if it's a reference type, it can be null, and if it's a value type, it's not, right? And if so, assuming that's correct, how will reflection answer if you ask about the open generic of a generic method decorated with maybe null? Because you can't say it's nullable or not, because you don't know yet.
That's the same issue as T question mark.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, this all makes sense if you look at specific instantiations of generic methods. But if you get an open generic, which reflection can talk about, how are you planning on answering these questions?
So my understanding from the way it's basically would mirror what C# thinks in the context of a generic, right? Like if you're inside the generic method, like what does C# think the T is, right? And the answer might be it doesn't think anything because you can't express it, but I don't actually recall what C# does in that case. Stephen might know more, but I would basically say we would mirror what the static type system in C# thinks.
Who was that question directed to?
I mean, I was asking what the API is going to do. Then Emo had an assertion that I don't know how to follow up on. But really, I'm just wondering, it's for any specific method that would be callable. You can look at things and you can answer authoritatively for the decorated state, not the data flow state. But any open generic, once it is looking at it depends on if T is a reference type or not. This API is going to give a definitive answer unless, I guess it could return unknown. But
I mean, if you want to do what C# does, it's if you have T question mark, it assumes it might be a reference type in terms of the things that it warns you about. So if you have a parameter that's T question mark, and inside your method you try and dereference it without asserting it's not null or without doing a null check, you'll get a this may be null warning, because that's true. It may be null.
Right.
And so presumably, if you have an open generic, it's returning a T question mark. If you ask it, what is the state of this? Presumably it's going to be maybe null.
Right. That's what I meant by mirroring what C# thinks in this case.
Okay. For some reason, I thought that you couldn't say T question mark unless you constrained it one way or the other to value or.
C#9.
Okay.
I think you couldn't at some point, then they changed it. That was my
You couldn't in C#8, and it was hard to write.
Yeah. I still think it's hard, but it's less hard.
The way you split the attributes makes complete sense. The top four are just subsets of question mark, right?
Right.
And the second set are all conditional based on runtime knowledge. So, or based on flow analysis rather. So, the top four are just sort of a more fine-grainedness on top of question mark.
It's fair. And then I'll ask the question just for the sake of asking it. For the things that we know at the bottom, would it be worth having a different answer that just says, flow dependent? There's a state here, it's complicated, we can't explain it. but there's a state
No,
here.
because it's not a different answer, right? It's just a more refined version of that answer, right? It's so basically you like the first four are still sufficiently describing the static information, right? You just may know additional things on top, like for example, does not return if this thing is false, for example, or sorry, does not return if this thing is null or something. That is something that you can now use in flow analysis, right? It doesn't really change your static answer for this method. It just means the static information that the compiler wants you about is a little bit smarter, right? So it's additional information, but like given that you can't really ask that question in reflection, there's really no point.
So a not null if not null will.
Sorry, the one problem with it are things like the maybe null when, because if you have if you have a parameter that's out string s, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you ignore these custom attributes, you're going to say this will always return not null. But if it's attributed as maybe null when false, then it actually can be null.
I see what you're saying. So basically the static information would say it's a non-nullable T, but because it has maybe null on it, we should probably assume that it can be nullable.
Right. If our goal is to assume the quote worst,
right,
then you probably want to factor maybe null when in as well. And
that's true, because the other ones are just refinements of when it cannot be null.
Not nulls will not null if not null and not null when go from allow you to turn something that is maybe null into something that is not null. So you would just return maybe null. That's fine. If assuming we consider that to be we want to return the most conservative guess as to whether something is null or not. Member not null, like that. I mean, I'm not sure that really matters for the scenarios this is targeted at. It's all about, you've called the.
Yeah.
Those don't matter. Does not return. I don't think those matter either. So then it's just maybe null. We probably need to treat maybe null when.
Yeah, that's
like
a fair
maybe
point.
null.
That's a good point. Yeah. And then do people have strong opinions on the naming of the enum?
I like that it maps to what we use elsewhere.
Yeah, I kind of like it because it kind of matches the attributes, which to me is the extent to which we expose it in the public API and the BCL. The C# compiler naming is just, I don't know, not exactly approachable. And I think Jan kind of felt strongly that generic type arguments should just be an array. I don't have super strong opinions. I mean, everything in reflection is kind of array-based, but it does violate our guidelines. And given that this thing is allocated, I mean, quite frankly, this thing is not super cheap to begin with, because it basically has to crack open custom attributes and stuff. I can go read-only collection of T. I can do array. To me, it's all the same.
I mean, we've had issues in the past with properties returning arrays because now we have a question of like, well, do we have to return the same instance every time, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the only thing is like, the reason why I don't care here is because the nullability info is not something you get off of reflection, right? You basically call a method and it instantiates it every single time you ask it. So if you mutate the instance afterwards, well, you mutated the instance that you created yourself. So to me, it's kind of like you own it. So if you stomp on it, it's your problem. Like I don't expect people to actually stash away these nullability infos, in which case the lifetime is limited to you ask one question, you get an answer. And if you then, in the process of doing so, you stump over your own data, well, that's on you. I don't personally care.
Yeah, it's just a question of, like, is it ever expected to do any kind of caching?
Yeah, so the only caching that we currently want to do is this, there's this, I forgot, it's nullable context that the compiler basically uses to compress the attributes, and we want to cache those when we look up things. So it's basically it's the private cache that is a nullability info context itself. But we don't cache nullability infos because that's too expensive and doesn't really provide much benefit.
Okay. There was a related open question about an unresolved question about where this should live, system reflection or system diagnostics code analysis. Because if you put this in code analysis, you don't have to follow the existing reflection patterns.
Yeah, I think Jan's argument was less about the pattern. It was more like, well, it's cheaper, so why would you go buy a wrapper collection that is yet another object that you create? And to me, as I said, like it's kind of like when you call create, you definitely create something new, so it's yours. If you want to mutate it, be my guest. So like that's why I did care.
Yeah, if we say like this object ref belongs to you, have fun, then yeah, that's a thing.
All right, so is that you want to return an array?
Well, I'm kind of asking the room because I mean, I can go either way. Like I think this thing is going to be, moderately expensive. So whether you create another object to me makes not a huge difference, but I also haven't profiled it by any stretch, right? So
I mean,
it's just that Jan felt strongly.
If you return an array, make it non-nullable and just return array.empty or something in the case where it's not relevant. But I guess that's my only feedback if we turn it into an array. I'm not opposed to making it an array.
Sorry, did I miss a question?
No, I was just giving feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you missed it, Levi's suggestion was if it's an array, get rid of the question mark and just use array.empty as there are no generic type arguments.
The other pattern is like the type info class is used as just IEnumerable. And so I guess there's two choices here.
Yeah, IEnumerable is just a little weird to work with sometimes because you can't really index into it. You can only really enumerate over it. So it's difficult if you're trying to like correlate the elements coming out of an enumerable with something else.
Yeah, I guess
which in this case I think you would want to do because you would probably want to go back to the original method info or something else and then start indexing the parameters off of that.
I mean, in fairness, that's why we exposed the type, right? So the idea would be that if you can basically get the corresponding type by just dotting and then say dot type. But yeah, I mean that's the general idea is that it seems like there's enough cases when you do reflection-based code where you have the index of the generic type argument and you just want to get it right. I think I don't know exactly why I went with null. I think the idea was if it's not a generic type, I return null because I think that's what reflection does. But I can totally do it. Anti-array makes sense to me. I mean, I don't have a.
I don't feel strongly about it to be honest. Whatever.
We should just. Paula just said this name sucks. Not sure what he saw, but I don't think he's commenting on what we're doing right now. So I think we should just do whatever reflection does. I think if reflection gives you an empty array, we should do an empty array. If reflection gives you null, we should probably do null. Just because I mean you use both of them at the same time most likely.
I mean it's reflection. It probably throws.
Actually, that's a good point. But I know it's a property, right? So it can't do that.
Returns empty types. Returns an empty array.
Okay, then we should do an empty array. Cool. Okay. Then, are we happy then with the shape as it is? What do people think about the method case? Yes, no, meh.
Sorry, the method case.
So basically, should we have a create method that takes a method info, or should we just say no? You need to know that you have to pass a method dot return parameter.
I think taking a method info seems reasonable.
I might name it something other than create because it's not intuitive as to what create over method info would give you. So maybe like create for return value or something like that.
Yeah, like what I don't like about that is now you have this weird split in the overloads, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's why I originally didn't have it, because the other ones, it's kind of clear what you're asking for. For the method, it's a bit odd. But I guess you could make the same argument about the property info, because you logically have a getter and a setter. So in both cases, you just talk about the return, really. But I guess you don't, right? Because they have read and write state now. Never mind. Yeah, I think that's the reason why I didn't go with method info, because it's somewhat ambiguous.
Okay, I mean, it can always be added later.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, if people are happy with that, then we can approve that.
So just as a concrete example, say that I give you list of t dot add the parameter being the parameter that corresponds to the item to add within that method, and I pass that parameter info to create. What would the nullability info that I get back tell me?
So which type is it on? List of t?
Open list of t.
It would probably be not annotated, right?
Well, that's one of the cases where the t itself is the annotation and there's no attribute on the parameter. Like if I have a list of string or a list of string question mark, from the runtime's perspective, these are the exact same type. The compiler is the thing that knows the difference between the two. So I'm wondering, like, if I say type of list of open dot get method add dot get parameters sub 0 and then pass it into nullability info context dot create, what data would I get back from the nullability info?
I mean, that's the kind of problem, right? Like, I mean, open generics are kind of weird. Like, people don't even know how to do it in C#, right? Because in C# you don't really use open generics, right? People think they do, but it's usually they're inside the generic type or method, and they use their T, and they think that's an open generic. But in that case, it's bounded by whatever that T's annotation happens to be, right?
Okay, ignore the open generic then. List of string question mark, get method add, get parameters sub 0. And then I pass that to the create method. What do I get back?
Whatever the add method set for the generic, which I think is probably just whatever is the T, and the T in this case is string question mark, so it should be maybe null.
But what about list of string, not list of string question mark? Would it be maybe null or not null?
If it's list of string and when you when you compiled your code, assuming you had nullable annotations on, then that concrete generic type parameter would be marked as the non-nullable string. So it should tell you it's a not null string at that point.
But that's the problem, right? List of string and list of string question mark are literally the exact same type from the runtime's perspective.
Right, but that's why I'm saying it depends on, like, when you basically do type of, right? You say type of list of string, right? When that code is compiled with the annotations, it is recorded in metadata what your type was, right? It's not something that yes, they have the same runtime type, but like we know what generic type argument you passed into, and that has the attribute on it that says, I'm not null.
It does?
Are you absolutely sure? Because I thought type of list of string and type of list of string question mark like literally result in the exact same code gen. Because I'm pretty sure there's only one type actually backing the whole thing.
I mean, you're probably right for the exact type of scenario, but I think the idea is normally you get your list of T or your list of string from something else, like somebody declared a property or something, right? And that thing has annotations on it, right? So like for all practical purposes, when you actually walk somebody's type, you know what their annotations were, right? Because they are expressed metadata. So yeah, the exact type of scenario is probably always going to be unannotated because it's, there are no annotations, right?
Yeah, like, but this, no, you're right. So if I have a property that returns list of string question mark, for instance, then when I get that property info and I pass it to create, the get generic arguments, is going to return a T that has an annotation that says maybe null.
Yep.
because that should actually be an annotation on the generic. But if I look at the type property, the type property will just be list of string, not list of string question mark. So that means that as a caller, I still need to keep track of all of these different hierarchies myself.
Well, that's why I repeat the type on the nullability info, right? So the idea is if you care about nullable annotations, you should be able to just walk nullable info. So basically, just with that, you should be able to produce, for example, a string that has either question marks or exclamation marks or whatever you want to use to annotate it, right? So
Yes.
you basically can construct that type information. But yeah, you're right. The instance of system type itself will never know whether it's null or non-null because it's only a single instance for
I
both
guess
sides.
I guess the thing that I'm driving at ultimately is if I want to know if it's valid to pass null into the add method of some list of string, then it's not sufficient for me to have only the list of string instance that I care about. I actually need to go back to what API originally gave me this list of string and follow its nullability info context all the way back there. Correct? That's the only way that it sounds like it's possible to do this.
I believe so. I mean, that's the general problem with null, right? Because it's logically not associated with the type, right? It is logically stored on the use side of the type, and yeah, if you don't have the use side, you don't know.
Yeah, I'm looking at SharpLab. I don't see anything in the output IL that suggests there was a question mark in type of list of string question mark.
Yeah, I think that's because I mean, type of has to resolve to a type token, and there's only one, right? So
yeah, there's only one. So the reason I bring this up is it might have interesting impact on how things like system text JSON need to honor these if they do want to honor them for things like binding.
Yeah, but in that case, I mean, you don't really have to honor it for the type itself, right? You almost have to honor it for basically a field or a property, right? Or a constructor parameter, right? So in which case you're always in the case of a use side.
Well, maybe, because if I know the way that system text JSON works now, and Steve, please correct me if I'm saying something incorrect, but I know that you have converters for things like list of t. If I have a model object, so public class foo, that has a property that returns a list of string and another property that returns a list of string question mark, presumably those two things are actually going to have to filter down to different converters when system text JSON ultimately goes to create an instance of this from deserialization, correct? Because one converter is going to have to understand that null was valid and the other converter is going to have to understand null was not valid. So this is going to start creating potentially multiplicative complexity within system text JSON itself.
Today, the converters understand themselves if they're value type or reference type, and they don't know what property they're bound to. For example, they only know about the type.
What I'm suggesting is you would actually have to start flowing that information through.
Yeah, if you want to handle that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
it depends on where you want to handle it, right? I guess for collections, you kind of want to do it on the type. I guess that's true, but I think regularly, I mean, I would think if you want to enforce it in system text.json, I think you would do it for the cases where you call a constructor, set a property, or set a field, right? I don't know what else. I mean, these are the normal cases and in those cases, you know the nullable annotation, right? Because you're clearly standing on the thing that is possible to annotate.
Today, there is special null handling system text JSON, and if we could detect whether the corresponding property or field is nullable or not, allows a null through these attributes, and it would be an error condition, I think, and we could do that independently of the converters.
Are these APIs powerful enough to give you the information you need?
Well, I did have a question, and I don't see it documented here, and that is if there's no attributes or no nullable, C# nullable context, what are we returning?
Yeah, if you scroll down, basically the enum will give you the unknown. It's basically unannotated, right?
Okay, so if you have a reference type, you're going to get unknown. If you have a value type, you're still going to get unknown?
That is a good question.
Value types you should be able to know aren't ever null.
I believe for value types you should get yes.
For nullable value types, maybe null, but just normal value type will be unknown.
There was a discussion I think we had last time, is like, should we handle nullable value types? And I think the conclusion was we probably should.
Basically, I think there was a couple discussions previously around whether these APIs should help you for cases that you don't have a nullable context, and whether you even care if there's a nullable context. I mean, a C# nullable context, not this nullable context class thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, in C#, like, nullable context is just an implementation detail of the way they compress the metadata, right? Like, logically in C#, it's just you either annotated an API with a nullable annotation or you didn't, right? And so you either said, I don't know whether this reference type is null or not null, or you said, well, I do know, and it's either null or not null, right? And so that's basically the three states that a given reference type can have. And then the nullable context that C# is using is just basically flipping around the default so that the amount of metadata that they have to emit to keep track of those is just smaller, right? But it's logically complete implementation detail of the encoding.
Right, but if you don't have any attributes at all because you didn't enable nullable context,
right,
then that was my question.
Yeah, that's basically the unknown case, right? Or they call it oblivious, right, or whatever it's called, because it's just whatever was basically before they had nullable annotations, right?
Yeah. So the previous discussions around this was whether we should try to help in that case and say, hey, you have a reference type, of course it can be null. You have a value type, it can be null if it's wrapped in nullable T, otherwise not.
Right. Yeah, so one thing we should probably close on is, like, should we handle nullable of T or should we not? And I can go either way. I think they have both pros and cons, but
similarly, I mean, C# as the language handles equal null, but I don't know that all languages treat nullable of T as the same. It special compares against the null literal inequality.
well,
in
it's
IL,
not
it
just,
certainly doesn't. So,
I mean, it's not just in C#, right? Like, the runtime has special knowledge about it, right? Because if you box a nullable of T, and the nullable of T is said to be null, you actually box a null value.
Well,
and
you get
similar
the
when you
null
unbox,
box, right? I think.
No, literally the value is null. Like, you actually end up boxing a null reference.
Okay.
So it's not just you. So like if you basically, there's special knowledge in the runtime for boxing and unboxing a nullable of T, right?
Fair enough.
So basically, there's no way you can never get a box that contains a nullable of T. Like, if you basically box a nullable of T, it just boxes the underlying value. So basically you get, let's say you have an int question mark and you box it, your box contains an int, not an int question mark. And similar, if you box an int question mark that happens to be null, you just box a null value. That's basically the behavior of the runtime. So in that sense, it is handled by the runtime, not the language. And then the language just has additional semantics when you do casting and stuff like that, right? Or have operators and stuff. And they have this lifting semantics when you say, int question mark plus int, then they lift the other int, and then they resolve the operators over the nullable of int and blah, 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 right? But that's, yeah. Maybe you can ignore that part.
Yeah.
So that's why I said, to me, I can go either way. Right? You could, because reflection is all object based. So if you actually set a property that is, let's say, in question mark, because the values that you're actually exchanging are basically over the underlying type, not the nullable type. It doesn't strike me as insane to say it would be nice if nullable info would give you that nullable information. The only question now becomes is, like, what is type? Is type now the unwrapped thing? So should it say int or should it say nullable of int, right? And that's why I said, to me, that it has pros and cons. Like, when I originally wrote it, I just went with, we just exposed the C# notion of nullable reference types. So as far as value types are concerned, they're always treated as, not null, and type might give you nullable of int, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be honest and say that the type is int question mark, and if you want to say that that represents itself as maybe null, then that's a starting point.
So you basically say, like, the type property nullability info would just return whatever you invoked it on, and that might be int question mark or int. But then the read state and write state might actually tell you something better than not null.
Well, I think so. It's let's go back to let's take a simple parameter of int question mark, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess super. Let's go with a simple method return of int question mark, and there are no other. This is the unannotated case. I think it would be reasonable to say that the type is nullable event, because that is the type that is being returned. But if you're calling it via a reflection API, there were comments in the chat that it is not a boxed null. It is, in fact, you get the null reference for object. Like if you say object, is it 0? Yep. It is the 0 box. Or you don't get a box. Yes, that's what it's. You don't get a box. You get null. And so then the answer is, if you call it via a thing that can be cast or be interpreted as object, then yes, null can appear. So therefore, it may be null. If cast to object, null might appear. So that's why I think that's a reasonable starting place, other than saying, well, it's obviously nullable of t if the type was a value type and it said maybe null. I would just be like, the type is nullable of t, or nullable event, and the answer is it might be null because, well, it's nullable.
Yep, I think that makes sense to me.
And then, yeah, really, it would come down to, after it gets, stood up, can the JSON serializer or whatever make sense of the state once it looks at it in practice, or if it finds its special casing nullable of t to invert the logic in some manner, then that suggests maybe we want to do something different before we ship. But
does anybody know, does C# actually allow these custom attributes, or does it honor the custom attributes on nullable value types?
The not null win and stuff?
Yeah, can I basically have a property of type in question mark and then basically annotate the getters and setters and say the setter will never give you null? Basically do the, what is it? I always forgot what the syntax ends up being, but
I think it's disallow null is a attribute you put on the set.
Yeah, I think that was the thing, right?
So if you want to set this, you have to give me a value, and if you're asking, I'll tell you no one has set a value yet. Yeah, I don't know if that works or not. I could see it making sense.
C# fails to compile it. It says attribute disallow null is not valid on this declaration type. It's only valid on property indexer field. And oh, actually, I put it in the wrong spot, I guess. So I can't do disallow now. I have to say, oh, I have to put it on the property, not the setter. Okay. Okay, so that one compiles. Now the question is, what does it do? I can totally assign null to it, and the compiler does nothing. Do I have to turn nullable for that? I don't think so, right?
But yeah, like I said, I assume it'll come down to aggressive prototyping of try consuming the data and see if it feels like it made sense naturally.
Actually, the compiler no wants. In a turn nullable, it says a possible null value may not be used for a type marked with not null or disallow null. So yeah, the compiler does honor them on nullable value types. So yeah, we should do the same thing. So basically what I'm hearing is, yeah, we should just special case nullable of t.
Okay.
Which makes sense for us to do. I mean, it is a special type.
All right. Yep. So yeah, personally, I'm not a fan of the maybe null name, but that's the amount of complaining I'm willing to do about it. So
what would you like to see instead? Nullable?
I think, yeah, nullable seems better to me. I think nullable was reproposed via YouTube chat.
I can go with that. I mean, the reason I went with not null and maybe null is purely because of the custom attributes. I mean, I have literally no opinion on that.
I mean,
Maybe.
nullable doesn't, something being nullable doesn't mean it is null. It just means it is maybe null, right? So
Yes, able to be null. Null able.
Yeah.
My biggest objection to maybe null is maybe null should have a capital B, but that should be true in the attribute as well. And that because we were not saying it may be null, we were saying it may be null, and those are slightly different.
Sure.
Is it
But
null?
that ship sailed.
Maybe.
For some reason, I'm not thinking of Arrested Development. So yeah, I think nullable is fine. I think Booyah said the same thing. I think that's reasonable. So we would have unknown, not null, and nullable. I can do that.
Okay, now can I figure out where I am on the virtual screen?
If
The
you-
TV
if you-
switched inputs again.
If you add nullable, maybe nullable state, the name of the enum should be nullability state then.
That works for me too.
Because it also matches nullability info.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yep. Considering that we try to get rid of nulls, we have to add a lot more stuff that has null in the name.
Yeah. So, sorry, you were saying, Boya?
Yeah, I have a question about the maybe null when. Are we saying if there is this attribute, then we just say it maybe null? I mean nullable.
That's we. That was
Yes.
suggested earlier of moving it from the it not respected into the respected
Yeah.
table.
Basically, you report the weaker guarantee, right? That's the idea.
I don't want. There we go.
Boya, have you thought about what package this would go into?
Package. This would go straight into callhip.
But how would like system text JSON consume this, for instance?
You would have code that says if net6.
Why? Like nullability exists prior to net6. Why would this be a net6 specific feature?
Well, I mean, it's just the default, right? So I mean, so I'm not trying to say we wouldn't ship it as a package, right? I'm just saying like my default assumption was we just ref reflection and edit. If we think that's a feature that should be available out of man, so that things like system text.json or other OU packages can use it, then I think we can do that. I mean, it seems to be something that can totally sit separately on top. There's no reason why it would have to go into callhip. But it also seems weird to me to, like, if we just ref the platform itself, right, ignoring down level for a second, it would seem weird to put in, 3 types in a brand new assembly, right? Just because we can, right?
I mean, it wouldn't be because we can. It would be because we apparently have a significant enough code base compiling against, say, NetStandard 2.0, who also want to be able to use nullability. And like we didn't tie nullability to netcore, so why would we tie this to netcore?
I mean, we kind of sort of did, but yeah.
System text JSON has nullability annotations.
Well, that goes back to like what's our official stance on that. I don't know. And officially, our stance is that NetStandard 2 doesn't support C# 8. So, but so to be clear, I'm not saying that we should not ship this as a package. All I'm saying is when I thought about it, I just thought about it as a Net 6 feature, right? And I think within Net 6 we should put it where it makes sense. If we, for example, I think Jan brought this up as a concern: should this go into callhip? So if we think it shouldn't go into callhip, it should go into a separate assembly anyways, then, just ubing that assembly as is probably the simplest, right? If it goes into callhip and then we also ub it, then, we can do that too. Because, I mean, the API can probably be frozen pretty much on day one because it probably doesn't change anyways. And then we can do that too. I just didn't start with that.
Yeah, it looks like the maybe null attribute is not NetStandard 2.0. It's netcore only. So most of if you're using nullability is you're using netcore. not
The
Yeah.
attributes can be defined inside your own assembler.
Yeah, that was and they can even be internal. The compiler doesn't care about visibility, just cares about the name, and
That's
will
right.
honor them when they're present. So the idea was, if you want to do C# 8 in .NET Standard 2, you would just copy the attributes and make them internal.
Right. That's why our net standard 2.0 packages have property declaration or attribute declarations injected into them.
Yeah, and I think if you look at our source file, it literally says that you can set a define that changes the visibility from public to internal, I think.
Yeah, like I have to say, if we want serializers in particular to take a dependency on this, and then we tell people, oh, by the way, your serializer now has different behavior based on whether it's running on full framework or net core, even though the object graph it's looking at is the exact same in both cases, like that makes me nervous.
I mean, that's a fair concern. I think I just wrote serializers because it seemed to make sense when I wrote it. I'm not saying we need to honor it in system text.json. It's just something that we could honor in system text.json, right? And I think I would leave it up to Steve and Naomi to make a determination whether that's a good idea or not. The actual scenario that was brought to me was ASP.NET's model binder and EF. They're particularly the two people that asked.
Yeah, because model
we
binding would
this.
definitely use this. Yeah.
Yep.
One complication in making it OOB or .NET 6 is that the compiler has been changing the way it adds the nullability information, so it'll be more complicated if we have to detect that.
To be clear, I think the compiler is done now. I think they changed it halfway through 8 based on our feedback that it loads metadata. So like the idea is that it is frozen for all eternity. So if you wanted to do it yourself, you could. It's just quite a bit of code to get it right. But the compiler promised to never change the way it's encoded.
I see. It might. I mean, you do link to some other possible new attributes and optimizations and things like that, though, right?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Like, I mean, I think the compiler did say, like, maybe we add new custom attributes, but it's actually hard to do that too, right? Because if you add new custom attributes, it might introduce new warnings, right? So, for example, if you wouldn't have shipped the maybe null when attribute in v1, if we wouldn't add it now, well, it would change the how the flow analysis would reason about a ref parameter, right? And so, but I think that was accepted as a thing because we said we may want we want to be able to change nullable annotations themselves anyways, and we don't consider that a breaking change, or we consider that an acceptable source breaking change, I should say. And so in that sense, I think, yeah, it's possible that you run on .NET Framework, and then based on the presence of new attributes that add later, yeah, you may actually change the behavior of what the serializer thinks is nullable or not nullable. But that seems kind of more far-fetched because I think the only area where they will likely add attributes is for flow analysis. I think for static representation, I think we have everything we need already. So I don't think it's very likely that serializers would actually have different behavior ever. Famous last words, but
yeah. And we also decided the appropriate namespace is system reflection, not system diagnostics code analysis.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, either way works for me, honestly. Like, it depends on what you like. I think the idea is that the analysis namespace is mostly for producers of APIs, right? And they don't necessarily reflect over them. So that's why I think reflection may make more sense.
I saw, Jeremy, you gave a thumbs up, so you agree with that statement then?
Like the place that you use this, right? It takes property infos and method info, or not method infos. It takes property infos and other things that are too small for me to see since the TV turned off. And like you're doing reflection when you want this. So it feels weird that it would be go add this other namespace to go find the answer. If you want the flow state because you are APIs of .NET and you're trying to rebuild all of the declaration in a unified manner, then yeah, you're going to also need that namespace, except you're not. You're going to need weird reflection stuff because of the locally defined versions of the attributes. So, so reflection makes way more sense to me.
I don't use reflection at all. I go by the Roslyn API.
Yeah.
I have to deal with those. know.
A scenario. But yeah, so reflection makes more sense. It's basically, this comes down to what's the namespaces you would have already had an import for when you want to use this.
Right.
Everything it takes is reflection. You're obviously doing reflection when you do it. It feels like reflection.
Sounds good.
And so I think we can say that we would approve the API as is, and then the assumption is it's net 6 only. And then if our PM feels like it's warranted down level, then Emo, can come up with a packaging proposal, and that's has to be routed through our down level packaging person, which is Emo, and then that Emo basically gets to do whatever he wants. So
I mean, to me, it's mostly a scenario thing, right? So if once our serializer guys want to actually use it, I think at that point we probably have a requirement to make it available, right? And we can, like, one option we have in systemtext.json is to just copy that code and make it internal to systemtext.json, because it won't change, right?
Yep.
So like that's one option we have, and we have done that in the past.
It won't change until it does in the next version of C#.
Well, no, they promise that they won't. So basically, it can only be additive. So basically, because it's a metadata encoding thing, right? So they can't change the way the actual representation is persisted in metadata.
That's fine, but the addition of attributes could change our answer for certain nullability states.
yeah, and then you would get the state where it's the system text JSON 7 package, which was rebuilt out of the 7 tree. If assuming it does source inclusion instead of source copy paste, it'll just now know about these new attributes as well. But if you get the version 6 one, it doesn't, and whatever.
I mean, that will be true no matter what, because if we put it in a package, if you have the old package, it doesn't know about the new attribute either, right? So like whether we copy the implementation into systemtext.json or have it as a standalone package, you only know what you know at the time you ship that package, right?
I feel like maybe I'm arguing against the tide here, but like it seems not helpful to the ecosystem if we say like, oh, you want this stuff, just copy all the code into your own project.
So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying we shouldn't ship a package, right? I'm just saying, like, we have options, and to me, it's kind of a function of like how many people need that, right? Yeah. Whether that's warranted, right? And so, given that Nullability has shipped a while ago, there are not that many people that want this. I mean, this got a decent amount of upvotes. I think it got like 100 comments or something, which is more than I expected, but I think it's also more because people just expect the platform to be able to do that. I don't think that the people that all commented actually really need that.
Okay.
But, famous last words as well, right? But I mean, I think our general stance is you first draft the platform and then you ship it later anyway. So I think that's also not terrible. So we can be a bit more reactive here.
Okay, yeah, and you're right. We always have the ability to UB it after the fact.
Yep. All right, so I've posted the notes and marked it approved. And
perfect.
I note that we are past time, and therefore we will see everyone who cares to join us at our next regularly scheduled session, which is 10 a.m. on Tuesday, Redmond time as always. Where at least one of us is actually in the city of Redmond right now. Hello, Concrete. And with that, I declare the meeting adjourned, and I have the gavel.
Thanks.
See you next time.